got my science degree, and then because I'd loved high school, my teachers and everything, I'd really loved all of that. So I decided that I'd wanted to be a teacher, and I thought I'd be a maths teacher. So after my science degree, I did a diploma of education, which was an extra year. And for the diploma of education, you have to do some prac teaching. So I did some prac teaching at Pulteney Grammar and at Erbray High School.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. I wasn't much older than the kids at school. You know, I was teaching year 11s in these sort of practice terms. And the kids were, half of them were the young fellas, they were bigger than me. I remember at Erbray, you know, that half of them were wearing black beanies and, you know, pretty tough kids. And I had a little Mini Cooper, not a Mini Cooper, a mini car that I'd drive to work. And some of these kids had, you know, big cars and they wanted to drag me in the car park and things like that. Sorry. It was in some ways it was quite daunting being such a young person and then out there teaching. Anyway, so I did my teaching diploma and that was great, but I couldn't get a teaching job. So I had to look around for another job. And I just happened to see an advert in the university newsletter looking for graduates at IBM, which is the International Business Machines company, a global company, massive computing business. I had no idea who they were, so I had to do a bit of research. No, I couldn't Google it because there was no such thing as Google back then, but in the library or wherever. Went to an interview, did an aptitude test, seemed to go okay, and got the job with IBM.
Doing what?
Well, IBM turned out to be the one and only company I ever worked for. So for the next 30 plus years, I worked for IBM in a whole range of different areas. I started off as a systems engineer, which is sort of on the software engineering side. And this was in the days before the personal computer, so when I joined. But the next year, second year of my career there, the IBM personal computer came out. And I've got a little prop here to show you. I don't know if you can see that there. This is what the IBM personal computer looked like back then.
Yeah, there's the floppy drives. And
keyboard, had little floppy drives in here and a little screen. Originally, I think it was a black and white screen, but you could pay through the nose for a colour one.
Yeah.
But the original personal computer in Australia, this was the first computer that would allow people to have a computer in their homes or small businesses instead of having these massive computers. So this was a big deal, and it actually helped IBM to become even more popular.
That's right. And also just want to point out before we go to a break, that is not to scale. They were a lot larger than that. Just because, you know.
Yes, we're chatting to Mark, who was working for IBM at the advent of the personal computer.
That's right.
Stuck with him for many years.
I did. And throughout those years, I ended up doing so many things. I started off in the engineering side. I moved into sales. I was in marketing for a while. I was in sales operations for a while.
Okay, I have a question regarding that. Okay, so to sell a computer, like, that's not that small, because they're a lot bigger than that. What did you say to people? How did you describe this to people who'd that wanted
Okay, well, to cut a long story short, it's really all about talking to your prospective client and asking them what it is they do and what they need help with.
Okay.
And depending on what they do and what they need help with, we've got a solution for you. Yeah, and there's lots of things that, as you know, computers can do, and companies were learning as well as the technology improving, and so it was really a people business, talking to people, finding out what it is they did and what they needed, and then helping to put together a solution.
And did the people that come to you, did they already know what a computer was, or did you have to describe that to them as well?
Bit of both. A large back in those days, government business was possibly one of the biggest areas. And there was lots of processing of records, files and records. So computers used to do a lot of filing and data retrieval and things like that. So customers knew what they needed to do, and they didn't necessarily know what could help them to do it better and make it faster and more accurate and so on. So customers were aware of computers, have been around since the 50s in very large configurations. But as processing technology got faster and storage capacity got bigger, we were able to bring out smaller computers that were still very powerful. It's really interesting when the Apollo 11 spaceship got to the moon, the computing power they had on there was about as powerful as a little calculator. So in fact, the power that you've got on your mobile phones is even more powerful than what they used to get to the moon. So back in those days, they had to use a lot of brain power as well. So
The good old days.
the good old days. I mean, I don't know, maybe one of the worries possibly about today is the fact that with all this technology to help us, we don't use our brains as much as we used to in the old days. So I think we've need to be a bit careful about not letting our brains become too lazy. We've got to keep working them and putting them to use. So anyway, slight aside there. But
so did you use the big floppy disks or the...
Well, we had...
Describe a floppy disk to people who might not even know what a floppy disk is.
Yeah, well, a floppy disk was a little bit like a CD disk. Now, some of you may not know what a CD is.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
It's a round thing like this,
Like
but the floppy one,
coaster,
it had information on the magnetic strip, and but it was floppy because it was of the material it was made of.
Okay.
And so you would have your computer like this or bigger ones, and you would put the floppy disk in a disk drive. It would read it and get the information off of there.
Yeah.
They then moved to hard disks, and with bigger capacity, and then they moved to transistors and electronic circuitry, which was even a greater capacity and so on. I don't want to bore people with all the technology, but technology back in those days was doubling in capacity, doubling in speed every 2 years or whatever it was, and it continued that way for 20 plus years or so.
Yeah.
Nowadays, the amount of power that we have in our pockets is incredible.
Yes, it would be. For you to have been part of that adventure and journey.
Yeah. And it was also great because actually, as a result of joining a multinational company, I ended up moving to Sydney and living and working there for 16 or so years. I also went and lived and worked in New York for 2 years. So I got to experience a large Australian city and a large global city, in fact, one of the most iconic cities in the world. And that was amazing, very full on. But in the end, I was very happy to come back to Australia because sometimes these large cities that have got lots of excitement and plenty of things to do can suck a bit of life out of you. So I needed to get back. Well, they needed me back anyway for work, but I was happy to get back to Sydney. And then even Sydney became just too much. The traffic in Sydney is a nightmare. The housing is a nightmare. And eventually I came back to South Australia and moved to the Adelaide Hills. So I went from the ridiculous to the sublime in a way, from New York back to the Adelaide Hills, lovely, quiet country town.
Yeah, what was the hardest part about living in New York?
Actually, I found it I didn't really find it that hard, but there's possibly, some of the cultural differences, just getting used to, tipping in a restaurant, which I'm happy to say we don't have in Australia really. Or to any degree over there, they need it because the waiting staff and so on, they're on a really low wage, and so they actually rely on tipping, 15 or 20% to get a decent salary. I didn't really find it that hard, to be honest. It's just it's in some ways it's kind of creeps up on you and it's a bit overwhelming. There's the population, the size of the population, the noise. It's a very noisy city to live in. But there's always something to do. It's a very diverse, multicultural place. We made some good friends there. In fact, when I first moved there, we were living just outside of the city. We're about a 50-minute drive out of the central New York, and we were at dinner with some friends, and there was a mutual friend of the friends was a local New York man, and we said, okay, it's time for us to go home and drive home. And he said, oh, look, it's getting a bit late. Don't drive all that way home. Here's the keys to my apartment. You stay at my place. I'll go and stay at my girlfriend's place. And we'd only just met him that night. And here he was giving us the keys to his apartment. He didn't know us from a bar of soap. And yet he was happy to let us stay at his place. So naturally, of course, we became good friends. But yeah, we found the people over there generally are lovely people, really happy, friendly people, which may not be the case with, say, the governments of some of these countries. So sometimes it's hard for us to tell the difference or to ensure we differentiate between the average citizen and the government that might be making decisions that we don't like.
Sure. Yeah.
You were happy to come back to
I was
Australia.
very happy to come back, and I had lots of friends back in Sydney, closer to family as well, here in Adelaide. I just felt that it was starting to become a bit overwhelming with I'm not sure if the social aspects or whatever it was in New York, but it could have overwhelmed me, and I could have got sucked into it a little bit more and going out and partying and all that sort of thing, which was okay once in a while, but not every weekend, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So when you moved back, were you able to still work for IBM?
I did.
Yeah.
I continued to work. I had an international role, so I was looking after people in different countries, particularly in Asia. So I did a lot of travel across Asia. I probably went to Japan and China 10 to 20 times in each of those countries. Conferences, meeting up with people that were my peers or that worked for me. So that was great. And I was on a pretty good wicket in terms of salary and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, the pressure of being in a high responsibility job does get to you after a while. And I really decided that I didn't want to get bogged down by that, get dragged down. Mm-hmm. Life is about more than just earning a big salary and traveling around the world. So I decided to move back to Adelaide, still working for IBM. My boss was in China at the time, living and working over there. And I had people still working all over the country as well as internationally. So it didn't matter where I was. So I decided I'm going to move back to Adelaide. So I moved back to Adelaide, didn't even tell my boss, because by then, communications were teleconferences, video conferences and that sort of thing.
So
lots of email work. So I could still do my job working out of the Adelaide office here. So that's what happened. And I came back in the mid-2000s.
Thanks for watching this short clip of Life Bus. Make sure that you hit the subscribe, like, and follow button. And for more, head to rawcut.com.au.